The blood was a lurid slash of crimson against the impossible white of the snow, a brutal punctuation mark at the end of a sentence she hadn't yet learned to read. Alara stood on the porch of her small, isolated cabin, the wind a physical thing that clawed at the worn wool of her shawl and bit deep into her bones. It was a wind that carried the scent of pine, the sharp promise of more snow, and something else, the metallic coppery tang of violence. The brewing storm had already begun to choke the sky, turning it the bruised color of an old contusion, and the jagged teeth of the mountains that surrounded her were slowly being devoured by a descending curtain of gray. She was no stranger to hardship. At 32, she had buried a husband, inherited a mountain of his debts, and been politely, but firmly, ostracized by the very town that had once been her home. They called her the widow of Widow's Peak, a name spoken with a mixture of pity and contempt. In their eyes, she was too old to be a desirable bride again, too plain to catch the eye of any man of means who might rescue her from her predicament. Her husband, Franklin, had been a kind man with a backbone made of jellyfish, and his passing had left her tethered to this small plot of land that a powerful man in the valley below desperately wanted. Silas Croft. The name was a sour taste in her mouth. He was a banker, a land baron, a man who wore civilization like a fine suit but possessed the soul of a starving wolf. He held the note on her land, a debt Franklin had foolishly accrued in a series of failed ventures. Croft had made his intentions clear in their last, chilling encounter in town. He wanted the land for its timber and the rumored mineral rights. He saw her not as a grieving widow, but as an inconvenient gray mouse to be swept out of his larder. His insinuations had been veiled, but the threat beneath them was as sharp and cold as the icicles now forming on the eaves of her roof. Her younger sister, Clara, was her only living family, staying with a neighbor in the valley, and the thought of Croft's shadow falling over her was a constant, gnawing fear. But the blood in the snow was a new kind of fear. It was fresh. The wind hadn't yet scoured it away or buried it. It was a stark, immediate declaration that the abstract menace of men like Croft had been replaced by a concrete and present danger. Her heart, a small, frightened bird in the cage of her ribs, hammered a frantic rhythm against her sternum. The smart thing to do was to bar the door, stoke the fire, and wait for the blizzard to pass, pretending she had seen nothing. The smart thing was to survive. She pulled the shawl tighter, her knuckles white. But Franklin, for all his weakness, had been a good man, and she, for all the town considered her plain and past her prime, had been raised on stories of frontier fortitude, where you didn't leave a soul to die in the snow, no matter the risk. With a sigh that plumed white in the frigid air, a sigh that felt like the surrender of her own safety, she stepped off the porch. She followed the trail of crimson blossoms, each one a step further away from the fragile safety of her home and deeper into the maw of the storm and the unknown violence that had visited her mountain. The trail led her not far, perhaps 50 yards from her cabin, toward a dense copse of snow-laden pines that stood like silent, white-robed sentinels. The splashes of red grew more frequent, smearing the pristine canvas of the landscape. The wind shrieked through the high branches, a sound like tortured souls, muffling the frantic beating of her own heart. She pushed a heavy branch aside, its load of snow cascading down her back in a frigid shock, and then she saw him. He was a heap of dark furs and leather at the base of a great ponderosa pine, a shape so large, and still she might have mistaken him for a fallen log or a bear hibernating in the wrong place. But bears did not wear buckskin trousers or bleed from a gaping wound in their side. He was lying face down, one massive, gauntlet hand outstretched, as if reaching for something that wasn't there. A long rifle lay half buried in the snow beside him. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the dull ache of the biting wind. This was not a hunter who had suffered an accident. This was the source of the blood, the victim of the violence she had scented on the air. He was a mountain of a man, built on a scale that seemed to belong to the wilderness itself, broad-shouldered, long-limbed, and exuding an aura of raw power even in his stillness. A thick mane of dark hair, streaked with a few strands of gray, was matted with snow and frozen blood. Alara crept closer, her movements cautious, as if approaching a wounded predator. She knelt, her knees sinking into the deep powder, and reached out a trembling, gloved hand to touch his shoulder. "Mister," she whispered, her voice a thin thread instantly snatched away by the wind. "Mister, can you hear me?" There was no response. With a grunt of effort, she pushed against his immense weight, managing to roll him slightly onto his side. The face she saw was not one that invited trust. It was a rugged, hard-hewn landscape of a face, all sharp angles and unforgiving planes, framed by a thick, untrimmed beard. A jagged scar cut a pale line from his left eyebrow down to his jaw, a permanent snarl etched into his flesh. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow and ragged, a faint rasping sound in the unnatural quiet between gusts of wind. The side of his heavy fur coat was soaked through with a dark, spreading stain. He was dying. The thought was as stark and cold as the air she breathed. The blizzard was no longer a threat on the horizon. It was a reality, the first thick flakes beginning to swirl around them, ghosts dancing in the dying light. To leave him here was to sign his death warrant. The wilderness would claim him within the hour. Her cabin, with its warm hearth and sturdy walls, was a lifetime away, yet only 50 yards. The internal debate was short and brutal. Her fear of this wild, dangerous-looking stranger warred with a deeper, more ingrained instinct for compassion. He was a man, hurt and alone. Her own solitude, the very thing the town pitted her for, had taught her the profound weight of being without help in a time of need. To turn her back on him would be to betray the very core of the woman she was, the woman who had survived Franklin's death and Croft's scorn, the woman who still believed in doing right even when the world had done her wrong. A grim resolve settled over her, displacing the fear. She would not let him die. Not here. Not like this. The struggle to move him was a monumental, back-breaking ordeal. He was a dead weight, a colossus of muscle and bone that seemed to mock her slight frame. She tried to lift him, her arms straining, her boots slipping in the deepening snow. It was impossible. Crying out in frustration, she grabbed the collar of his fur coat. She planted her feet, leaned back, and pulled. She pulled with the desperation of a woman who had nothing left to lose and everything to prove to herself. She dug her heels in, her muscles screaming in protest, her lungs burning with the effort in the frigid air. The snow was both a hindrance and a help, the smooth surface allowing him to slide, albeit with agonizing slowness. She moved backward, one grueling step at a time, her gaze fixed on the faint, welcoming yellow light of the lamp she had left burning in her window. It was her beacon, her lighthouse in the swirling white tempest. The storm was unleashing its full fury now, the wind a physical blow, the snow a blinding curtain that reduced the world to a chaotic whirl of white and gray. Each step was a battle. Her body ached, her fingers were numb inside her gloves, and the man's inert weight felt like an anchor dragging her down into the frozen earth. She fell, rose, and pulled again. She cursed, she prayed, she sobbed, but she did not stop. By the time she reached the rough-hewn planks of her porch, she was on the verge of collapse. Her strength was gone, her body a symphony of pain. With one last, desperate surge of adrenaline, she managed to heave his upper body onto the porch, his boots still dangling in the snow. She scrambled past him, her hands fumbling with the latch on the heavy wooden door. It swung inward, revealing the blessed sanctuary of her small home. The room was simple, dominated by a stone fireplace where a low fire still glowed, a small cot in one corner, a rough-spun table, and 2 chairs in the center. It was a Spartan existence, but it was hers. And now, it was a refuge for the wounded giant she was dragging across its threshold. She pulled him the rest of the way inside, his body leaving a wet, bloody trail on her clean-scrubbed floorboards. She slammed the door against the howling gale and threw the heavy wooden bar into place. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the crackle of the fire, the shriek of the wind outside the walls, and her own ragged, gasping breaths. She slumped against the door, her legs trembling too violently to hold her. She looked at the man lying on her floor, a dangerous, bleeding piece of the wilderness she had just dragged into her carefully ordered world. The blizzard had them now, a cage of ice and wind. They were trapped, together. And as she looked at the dark stains spreading from his side, she knew the hardest part of her ordeal had only just begun. For a long moment, Elara simply stood there, leaning against the cold wood of the door, her body shaking with a combination of exhaustion and terror. The man on her floor was an intrusion, a violation of the fragile peace she had carved out for herself in this isolated corner of the world. His sheer size seemed to shrink the small cabin, his wildness a stark contrast to her meager, domestic order. He smelled of pine, wet fur, and blood, a primal scent that filled the small space and scraped at her nerves. But inaction was a luxury she couldn't afford. He was bleeding on her floor, his life seeping away with every shallow, rattling breath. Shoving her fear into a tightly locked box in the corner of her mind, she pushed herself away from the door and moved toward him. First, the fire. She added 2 more logs from the woodpile, coaxing the embers back into a roaring blaze that threw dancing shadows across the room and began to fight back the invasive chill. Next, the man, kneeling beside him. She knew she had to get him out of his wet, frozen clothes. The fur coat was a monstrous thing, heavy and soaked through. It took all her remaining strength to unfasten the bone toggles and pull it off him, revealing a buckskin shirt beneath that was also dark and stiff with blood. Her hands hesitated for a moment before she took her sharpest kitchen knife and, with a deep breath, began to cut the shirt away from the wound. The fabric parted to reveal a landscape of flesh that made her gasp. His torso was a roadmap of past violence, a tapestry of old scars, white lines from knives, puckered circles from bullets long healed. But the new wound was angry and red, a ragged tear in the hard muscle of his side, just above his hip. It was oozing blood sluggishly, the edges raw and inflamed. It looked like a bullet had grazed him, tearing a deep furrow, but, blessedly, it seemed to have passed through without lodging deep inside. She hurried to the small pantry, her hands working automatically. She brought back a basin of water she had kept warming by the hearth, clean rags torn from old linen, and the small wooden box that held her meager medical supplies, a needle, gut thread, and a bottle of raw, potent whiskey. She also grabbed a small, orphan lamb's fleece she kept for warmth. The lamb itself, a tiny creature named Pip she was nursing after its mother had been taken by a wolf, bleated softly from its pen in the corner, its bright eyes fixed on the strange, large shape on the floor. Cleaning the wound was a grim task. The man remained unconscious, though he groaned and shifted when she probed the torn flesh, his body tensing with instinctual pain. Her own stomach churned, but she forced herself to be methodical. She washed away the dirt and congealed blood, her touch surprisingly gentle against his rough skin. She saw now that while he was imposing, he was also gaunt beneath the bulk of his clothes, the ridges of his ribs visible. This was a man who lived a hard life, one of hunger and battle. The whiskey was for sterilizing both the wound and her needle. She poured a little directly onto the raw flesh. The man arched his back with a guttural roar that ripped from his throat, his eyes flying open for a split second. They were a startling, pale gray, the color of a winter sky, and in that fleeting moment, they were filled with a feral, confused fury. Then they rolled back in his head, and he went limp again. The roar echoed in the small cabin, making Elara jump back, her heart pounding. The lamb, Pip, scrambled to the back of its pen, terrified. "Easy now," she whispered, as much to herself as to the unconscious man. "It's to help you." Taking a steadying breath, she poured a little of the whiskey onto a rag and wiped her needle and thread. Stitching the wound was something she had done before, on livestock, and once on Franklin when he'd had a mishap with an axe. But her husband's soft flesh was nothing like this man's tough, muscle-bound hide. The needle bent twice before she was able to force it through, her fingers aching as she laid in a series of clumsy but functional stitches, pulling the ragged edges of the wound together. When she was finished, she packed the area with a poultice of yarrow and moss she kept for such purposes and bandaged it tightly with the clean linen. She managed to wrestle his lower half out of his wet trousers, her face burning with a blush she was grateful he couldn't see, and covered him with every spare blanket she owned, piling them high. His fever was already starting, his skin hot and dry to the touch. All she could do now was wait. The blizzard raged for 2 days. The world beyond her windows ceased to exist, replaced by a churning, howling vortex of white. The cabin became an arc adrift on a frozen sea. Time lost its meaning, measured only by the rhythm of her chores, tending the fire, melting snow for water, feeding her small lamb, and caring for the stranger. He drifted in and out of consciousness, caught in the grip of a raging fever. He muttered and thrashed, his words a jumbled torrent of names and places she didn't recognize. He spoke of shadows and fire, of a woman named Sarah, and a betrayal that seemed to burn him even in his delirium. In his lucid moments, which were brief and far between, his pale gray eyes would fix on her with a raw, animal wariness. He did not speak, but the question was clear in his gaze. "Who are you? Where am I?" She would simply offer him a spoonful of broth or a cup of water, her movements slow and deliberate, and he would watch her, his jaw tight with suspicion, until the fever dragged him back under. She learned the geography of his face, the harsh lines softened by sleep, the tension in his jaw that never fully eased. She saw the exhaustion etched around his eyes, the deep weariness of a man who had been running or fighting for a very long time. Her initial terror began to slowly, imperceptibly, morph into a kind of grudging sympathy, and then something akin to curiosity. Who was this man the wilderness had thrown at her door? What demons haunted him in his fever dreams? On the third morning, the wind finally died down, and a weak, watery sunlight filtered through the grime on the window pane. The fever broke. Alara was dozing in her chair, exhausted, when a sound startled her awake. It was the soft bleating of her lamb, Pip. She opened her eyes to see the tiny animal had somehow managed to unlatch the gate of its pen and had trotted cautiously across the floor. It now stood a few feet away from the cot where the stranger lay, its head cocked. The man was awake. His gray eyes were open, and for the first time, they were clear and lucid. He was watching the lamb with an unreadable expression. He was still weak, but he pushed himself up onto one elbow, hissing in pain as the movement pulled at his stitches. Alara froze, her hand halfway to her mouth, expecting him to roar, to curse, to frighten the small creature away. The man was a personification of harsh survival. The lamb, a symbol of innocent vulnerability. Pip, emboldened by the man's stillness, took a few more hesitant steps forward and then nudged its wet nose against his huge, scarred hand, which lay on top of the blankets. Alara held her breath. The man's gaze shifted from the lamb to his own hand, as if surprised to find the creature there. For a long moment, he remained perfectly still. Then, slowly, deliberately, he uncurled his fingers. His hand, which he had seen clench into a fist the size of a small ham in his fevered sleep, a hand that was calloused and scarred and clearly capable of immense violence, moved with an almost impossible tenderness. He gently stroked the top of the lamb's woolly head, his thumb rubbing softly behind its ear. The lamb, far from being scared, leaned into his touch with a soft, contented sigh. A profound silence filled the cabin, broken only by the crackle of the fire. In that small, quiet gesture, a mountain of fear crumbled within Alara. A man who could be that gentle with a helpless animal was not the monster she had imagined. He might be dangerous, he might be wild, but he was not cruel. It was a pivotal, unspoken act of kindness that signaled, more clearly than any words, that he was not a threat to her. A fragile, tentative trust began to sprout in the barren ground of her fear. The man's eyes lifted from the lamb and met hers across the small room. The wariness was still there, but it was joined by something else, a flicker of gratitude, a silent acknowledgement of the care she had given him. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The quiet understanding that passed between them was more potent than any conversation. The storm outside had passed, and it felt as though a storm inside her had begun to quiet as well. The days that followed the breaking of the blizzard were filled with a strange, quiet tension. The man, who eventually introduced himself with the single, gravelly word Jedediah, was a taciturn presence. He healed with the same rugged determination that he seemed to apply to everything. Though weak and clearly in pain, he refused to remain idle on the cot. By the second day of his lucidity, he was on his feet, his immense frame making him seem like a caged bear in the small cabin. Alara watched him with a mixture of apprehension and fascination. He moved with a surprising economy of motion, a quiet grace that belied his size. There was no wasted energy, no superfluous gestures. When he moved, it was with purpose. The initial tension of a stranger in her home began to settle into a new, unfamiliar rhythm, a silent dance of two solitary people forced into close quarters. She would cook, and he would sit at the small table, his back to the wall, his pale gray eyes following her every move. It was not a threatening gaze, she realized, but an observant one. He was watching, learning, assessing. He ate what she gave him without comment. Thin rabbit stew, hard biscuits, dried apples, but with the focused intensity of a starving man. He never asked for more, but she found herself making larger portions, her own meager stores be damned. A peculiar domesticity began to bloom in the silence. One morning, she woke to the rhythmic thump. Thump! Thump of an axe. Peeking through the window, she saw Jedediah outside, stripped to the waist despite the biting cold, his back a road map of scars and taut muscle. He was using her late husband's axe, a tool Franklin had barely been able to lift, and he wielded it with effortless power, splitting the log she had struggled to manage into a neat, growing pile of firewood. He worked with one arm, his other held carefully against his bandaged side, yet he accomplished more in an hour than she could in a day. He brought the wood in and stacked it neatly by the hearth, his only acknowledgement a slight nod in her direction. Another time, he noticed a loose shutter banging in the wind. Without a word, he took a hammer and some nails from Franklin's old toolbox and, climbing onto a stool, secured it firmly in place. He moved on to check the other windows, the door, the roofline, his hands, so large and seemingly clumsy, proving to be remarkably adept. He was fortifying her home, making it safer, more secure. He was not just a guest. He was becoming a guardian. The bonding happened in these shared, silent tasks. He showed her how to properly sharpen her kitchen knives, his large hand gently guiding hers on the whetstone. He pointed out a flaw in the snare she used to catch rabbits, and with a few deft twists of wire, he fashioned a new one that was far more effective. The next day, a plump rabbit was waiting in it, and the stew that night was richer than it had been in months. Pip, the lamb, became a strange bridge between them. The creature adored him, often forsaking its warm pen to curl up at his feet as he sat by the fire. Jedediah would unconsciously rest a hand on its back, his fingers stroking the soft wool as he stared into the flames, lost in thought. Seeing this giant, scarred warrior, a man who looked as though he had been carved from the mountain itself, offering quiet comfort to a tiny lamb, chipped away at the last of Alara's reservations. The long evenings were the most intense. With the chores done and the world outside plunged into darkness, the cabin would grow quiet, the only sounds the sigh of the wind and the hiss and crackle of the fire. They would sit, she in her rocking chair with her mending, he on a stool across the hearth, cleaning his rifle or sharpening a knife. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was filled with unspoken questions, with the weight of their shared isolation. One night, the fire was burning low, and the cabin was filled with a warm, intimate glow. The silence felt heavier than usual. Alara found herself staring at him, at the way the firelight played across the harsh angles of his face, softening the scar, deepening the shadows in his eyes. He looked up, catching her gaze. For once, he didn't look away. "You saved my life," he said. His voice was a low rumble, rough from disuse, but the words were clear. It was the first full sentence he had spoken to her. Alara's heart gave a little flutter. "You would have done the same," she replied softly, though she wasn't sure if that was true. He considered this for a moment, his expression unreadable. "No," he said finally, his honesty brutal. "I wouldn't have. I've been alone a long time. Forgot how." The admission hung in the air between them, a stark and lonely confession. It was an opening, a crack in the formidable armor he wore. Alara felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to fill the silence, to share a piece of her own brokenness. "I'm alone, too," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She looked down at the torn shirt she was mending in her lap. "My husband, Franklin, he passed last spring. He was a good man, not a strong one. He left behind debts." She didn't mean to say it, but the words tumbled out, propelled by the strange intimacy of the moment. "A man in town, Silas Croft, he holds a note on this land. He wants it. He's made it very clear that he'll have it. One way or another." She looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I'm afraid, Jedediah. Not just for me. I have a sister, Clara. She's all I have left. I'm afraid of what he'll do to force me out." The name Silas Croft landed in the room like a stone. Jedediah, who had been relaxed, staring into the fire, suddenly went rigid. The air in the cabin grew cold. He sat up straight, his entire body radiating a new, dangerous energy. His pale gray eyes narrowed, becoming chips of ice. "Croft," he repeated, the name a curse on his tongue. "It was Croft's men who shot me." Alara stared at him, her mending forgotten in her lap. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. The blood in the snow, the ambush, his presence on her mountain, it was all connected. It wasn't random violence. It was targeted. Jedediah leaned forward, his forearms resting on his knees, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles were white. The gentle giant was gone, replaced by the apex predator she had first glimpsed. "Croft been trying to push settlers and trappers out of these mountains for 2 years," he said, his voice a low, gravelly growl. "He wants the timber, the water rights, the minerals he thinks are buried here. He uses the law when he can, and when he can't, he uses men like the ones who jumped me. Thugs and bounty hunters." He looked at his own hands, then back at the fire. His voice became distant, haunted. "I've been a thorn in his side. I know these mountains better than his surveyors. I've warned off his crews, pulled up his claim stakes when he puts them on land that isn't his. I cost him money he paused. So he decided to stop paying his men to run me off and start paying them to put me in the ground." He then told her his own story, not all at once, but in short, clipped sentences like stones pulled from a deep, cold well. He spoke of a wife, Sarah, and a young son, taken by winter fever in a settlement further west, a tragedy that had hollowed him out. He spoke of trying to build a new life, only to be betrayed by a partner in a freight business who stole everything and left him for dead. That betrayal had driven him here, to the mountains, where the only laws were those of nature, and the only person you had to trust was yourself. He had sought solitude as a shield, a way to ensure he could never be hurt or betrayed again. As she listened, Alara's own troubles seemed to shrink in comparison, yet they were also magnified. His pain resonated with her own loneliness, his story of betrayal echoing her own vulnerability to men like Croft. They were two sides of the same coin, two people broken by the world who had sought refuge in isolation. But their isolation was now compromised. Croft was the common thread, the venomous spider at the center of the web that had now entangled them both. The fire crackled, casting long, dancing shadows. The shared histories, tales of trauma and loss, had not created a bond of pity. They had forged something harder, something stronger. It was a bond of shared purpose, of mutual defense. They were no longer just a widow and a wounded stranger. They were allies. And as the night deepened around the small, warm cabin, they both knew that Silas Croft's hunt had not ended. It had merely been postponed. And next time, he would not come for just one of them. He would come for them both. A week passed, a period of strange, suspended peace. The world outside was slowly thawing, the sun gaining a little strength each day, melting the top layer of snow only for it to freeze again into a hard, icy crust each night. Inside the cabin, a similar process was underway. The cold, hard edges of suspicion between Alara and Jedediah were beginning to thaw in the warmth of their shared confinement. But a new, crystalline tension was forming underneath. The knowledge that Croft linked them, that his malevolence was a shadow stretching toward their door, was a constant, unspoken presence. The narrative of their lives had shifted. It was no longer about her survival or his recovery. It was about their collective defense. The cabin was no longer just a home. It was an outpost. Jedediah, now moving with only a slight stiffness in his side, fell into the role of a silent commander. He spent hours outside, circling the cabin, his keen eyes scanning the landscape, reading the snow for any sign of tracks, his senses tuned to the subtle language of the wilderness. He was a wolf patrolling his territory, and Alara found a strange, fierce comfort in his vigilance. His presence had reshaped her world. The silence she had once found oppressive was now a comfortable quiet, filled by the soft sounds of his movements. The scrape of his knife on a piece of wood he was carving, the soft thud of his boots on the floorboards, the steady rhythm of his breathing as he slept on the cot across the room. She found herself listening for these sounds, reassured by them. She was no longer alone with her fear. She was with a man who seemed to have no fear at all, only a grim, patient readiness. Their temporary peace was shattered on a cold, bright morning. A figure was spotted moving in the distance, a dark shape against the blinding white of the snow-covered valley below. Jedediah saw him first. He had been on the small porch, checking the sky, when his body went utterly still. He raised a hand, not to wave, but to signal Alara, who was inside, to be quiet. "Get back from the window," he commanded in a low voice. Alara's heart leaped into her throat. She obeyed instantly, her mind racing with worst-case scenarios. Was it Croft? His men? She pressed herself against the wall, her eyes wide, fixed on Jedediah's broad back as he stood in the doorway, his body blocking the view. He pulled his long rifle closer, resting it in the crook of his arm. He watched the approaching figure for a long time, his posture tense and wary. The figure was on snowshoes, moving with the slow, steady gait of someone familiar with the mountains. As he drew closer, Jedediah's posture relaxed almost imperceptibly. "It's just Old Man Hemlock," he said, stepping back inside and leaning the rifle against the wall. "He's a trapper, one of the few honest men left in these parts." Alara peeked around the doorframe. The man, now close enough to be seen clearly, was weathered and wiry, his face a leathery mask under a thick fur hat. He carried a pack and a rifle of his own. He stopped at the edge of the clearing, well out of pistol range, and raised a hand in a gesture of peace. "Jedediah," the man called out, his voice raspy. "Heard you had some trouble. Figured I'd check you hadn't gone and gotten yourself planted for good." Jedediah stepped back out onto the porch. "Not yet, Abe. What brings you up from the Devil's Playground?" The trapper, Abe Hemlock, trudged closer, his eyes darting from Jedediah to the cabin, noting the smoke from the chimney and the clear signs of habitation. He took in Jedediah's still bandaged side with a knowing glance. "Brought news," Abe said, his friendly tone dropping away, replaced by a grim urgency. "And it ain't good. I was down in town, selling some pelts. The whole place is buzzing. Croft is on the warpath." He looked past Jedediah to where Alara stood, half hidden in the doorway. He respectfully tipped his hat. "Ma'am," he grunted, before turning his attention back to Jedediah. "Croft knows you're alive," Abe continued, his voice low. "One of his hired gunslingers came limping back to town, frostbitten and half-mad, babbling about how you took out 2 of his partners before they could put you down. And what's more," he said, his gaze becoming even more serious, "he knows where you are. Or at least, he's got a damn good guess." He He's been telling anyone who will listen that the widow on the peak is harboring a dangerous fugitive and squatting on land that's rightfully his. He's using your debt, ma'am, he said, looking at Alara again, as justification. The air grew heavy with dread. Alara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the outside temperature. Croft was twisting the narrative, painting her as a criminal and Jedediah as her accomplice. He's gathering his men, Abe warned, a posse of the worst sort. Hired guns, bounty hunters with loose morals, and a few local boys he's paid off. He's waiting for the next big snow. Plans to use the cover of the storm to come up here and evict you, ma'am. Permanently. He's telling folks he's serving a legal writ, but we both know the kind of law Croft dispenses comes from the barrel of a gun. The warning, the confirmation of their worst fears, hung in the cold air. Abe Hemlock, their ally, had delivered the death notice. The abstract threat had now become a concrete plan with a timetable. How long? Jedediah asked, his voice flat and hard. Abe looked up at the sky, which was already beginning to haze over with high, thin clouds. Sky's got the look. Another day, 2 at most. Then you'll have a blizzard, and Croft will be right behind it. He shouldered his pack. I've said my piece. You two best be ready. He ain't coming to talk. With that, the old trapper gave them a final, grim nod and turned back the way he came, his snowshoes making soft, crunching sounds that were quickly swallowed by the immense silence of the mountains. He was their one and only warning. When he was gone, Alara and Jedediah stood for a moment in silence. The beauty of the day was now a mockery, the pristine snow a blank page on which their doom would be written. Jedediah turned and walked back into the cabin. The time for quiet observation was over. The time for fortification had begun. A cold, focused energy emanated from him. He moved with a new, lethal purpose. We'll need more water, he stated, grabbing 2 large buckets, and all the firewood you can stack inside. He'll try to burn us out. He then went to his pack, which had lain untouched in the corner, and pulled out its contents. Alongside dried meat and extra ammunition, he unwrapped an oilcloth to reveal 2 heavy pistols. He checked them, his movements economical and practiced. He looked up at Alara, who was standing frozen in the middle of the room, her face pale. He held out one of the pistols to her, but first, you know how to use one of these? Alara stared at the gun as if it were a coiled snake. No, she whispered. Franklin, he didn't believe in them. Franklin's not here, Jedediah said, his tone not unkind, but firm, stripping away any room for sentiment. Croft is coming, and he believes in them very much. You need to learn. He took her outside, to the back of the cabin where a shot wouldn't travel down into the valley. The pistol was heavy in her hands, a cold, alien weight. Her fingers trembled as he showed her how to load the cylinder, his large, warm hands covering hers, guiding the cartridges into place. You don't aim with your eye, he instructed, his voice low and close to her ear as he stood behind her, helping her correct her stance. You point with your body. Feel the line from your shoulder to the target. He placed a small tin can on a stump 30 feet away. Don't think. Just point and squeeze. Smoothly. Her first shot was a disaster. She flinched, jerking the trigger, and the gun roared, kicking back hard against her wrist. The bullet went wide, kicking up a spray of snow 10 feet to the left of the can. The noise echoed through the silent woods, a shocking violation. Her ears rang, and her arm throbbed. Tears of frustration and fear welled in her eyes. I can't, she said, her voice shaking. I can't do this. Yes, you can, Jedediah said, his voice a steady rock in her sea of panic. He took the gun, calmly recocked it, and handed it back to her. Fear is good. It keeps you sharp, but you can't let it rule you. You have a sister to protect. A home. That's what you think about. Not the noise, not the kick. Just what you're fighting for. His words struck a chord deep within her. He was right. This was not an abstract exercise. This was about Clara. This was about her home. This was about not letting a man like Silas Croft wipe her from the earth. A new, cold resolve began to replace her fear. She took a deep breath, raised the pistol again, and this time, when she looked at the tin can, she pictured Croft's sneering face. She squeezed the trigger. The gun bucked, but she held it steady. The gun leaped off the stump and disappeared into the snow. A stunned silence followed. She stared at the empty stump, then at the pistol in her hand, then at Jedediah. A slow smile spread across his rugged face, a rare and startling sight. It transformed him, chasing the shadows from his eyes. "See," he said softly, "you can." In that moment, something fundamental shifted within Alara. She was no longer just a widow, a victim waiting for her fate. She was a woman holding a weapon, a woman who had discovered a core of steel within herself she never knew existed. The fortification of the cabin had begun, but the true fortification was happening inside her own soul. They worked together as the sky turned gray, preparing for the storm, preparing for war. The blizzard arrived on the second day, just as Abe Hemlock had predicted. It did not come gently. It descended from the bruised sky like a shroud, a sudden, violent onslaught of wind and snow that erased the world. The temperature plummeted, and the wind howled around the corners of the cabin, a hungry, predatory sound. Inside, the small space was an island of defiant warmth and light in a sea of frozen chaos. They had done everything they could. The windows were boarded over from the inside, leaving only small slits to see and shoot through. Every bucket and pot was filled with water. A mountain of firewood was stacked against one wall, enough to last for days. The air was thick with the smell of gun oil, wood smoke, and a tense, electric anticipation. Alara moved about the cabin, her movements jerky and anxious, while Jedediah was a portrait of calm, lethal stillness. He sat by the hearth, checking his rifle for the 10th time, his face grim and unreadable in the firelight. The waiting was a unique form of torture. Every screech of the wind sounded like a footstep, every rattle of a loose board like a hand on the latch. Alara found herself holding her breath, her ears straining against the roar of the storm for any sound that was out of place. The pistol Jedediah had given her was tucked into the waistband of her skirt, its weight a constant, heavy reminder of the violence to come. "They'll come near dusk," Jedediah said, his voice cutting through the noise of the storm. He hadn't seemed to move, but his eyes were fixed on the narrow slit in the boarded-up window. "They'll use the failing light and the worst of the storm for cover." As if on cue, as the afternoon light began to fade into a murky, gray twilight, a new sound joined the symphony of the blizzard. It was faint at first, a rhythmic crunching, almost lost in the wind. They were here. Jedediah rose to his feet in one fluid motion, grabbing his rifle. "Stay away from the door and the windows," he commanded, his voice low and hard. "Get behind the woodpile, and don't fire unless they're inside." Alara scrambled to obey, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She crouched behind the tall stack of logs, peering between them, the pistol feeling slick with sweat in her hand. From her vantage point, she could see the main door and the front window slit. The crunching sounds grew louder, resolving into the tread of multiple men on snowshoes. Then, a voice, amplified by the strange acoustics of the storm, cut through the wind. It was Silas Croft. "Alara Martin, this is an eviction notice, served by the authority of my legal ownership of this land. You are harboring a known fugitive and murderer, Jedediah Kane. You have one chance. Send the man out and vacate the premises. If you do not, we will be forced to remove you." His voice was smug, arrogant, dripping with the false piety of a man who believed his wealth made him infallible. It was the voice of the civilized tyrant, using the language of the law to justify barbarism. A heavy silence followed, broken only by the wind. "He's giving them time to surround the cabin," Jedediah murmured as I pressed to the firing slit. "Fool, what do we do?" Alara whispered, her voice trembling. "We let them get cold," Jedediah replied grimly. "We let them get impatient. Then we teach them the price of trespassing." The first shot did not come from the cabin. It was a blast from a shotgun against the heavy oak door, a percussive boom that made the entire structure shudder. Splinters flew inward. It was a declaration of war. Immediately after, the assault began in earnest. Gunshots erupted from all sides, bullets thudding into the thick log walls of the cabin with dull, meaty impacts. One found a slit in the window where Jedediah had been standing a moment before, showering the inside with wood splinters. Jedediah didn't even flinch. He had moved to another position, a different small opening he had fashioned near the floor. He was a ghost, a master of his environment. He rested his long rifle on a log, took careful aim, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle's report was a deafening crack inside the cabin, a stark contrast to the muffled shots from outside. A choked scream answered, abruptly cut off. He worked with a terrifying, methodical competence. He was not a man in a panic. He was a craftsman at his trade, and his trade was death. He would fire, retreat from the opening, move to another, and fire again. Each shot was deliberate, aimed, and found its mark. He was a force of nature in his own right, a cornered grizzly defending its den with savage efficiency. Alara watched, mesmerized and horrified, as this man, who had shown such tenderness to a lamb, unleashed a controlled, righteous fury that was awe-inspiring. The attackers, expecting a terrified widow and a wounded man, were met with a disciplined, lethal defense. Their initial barrage faltered into sporadic, less confident shots. They were fighting a ghost they couldn't see in a blizzard that was as much their enemy as the man in the cabin. "They're trying the back," Jedediah barked, already moving toward the rear of the cabin. "Watch the front." Alara's world shrank to the narrow slit in the boards. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the pistol. She could see dark shapes moving through the swirling snow, wraiths in the storm. The front door groaned again as a heavy object, probably an axe, slammed into it. Thud, thud, crack. Then a new, terrifying sight. A flicker of orange light. One of Croft's men, braver or stupider than the rest, had made a desperate run for the cabin, holding a flaming torch. He was trying to get close enough to throw it on the roof or against the wall. He was trying to burn them out. From the back of the cabin, Jedediah's rifle cracked again. The man with the torch stumbled, dropping it in the snow where it hissed and died, but another man was right behind him, scooping it up. The situation was becoming desperate. Jedediah couldn't be in two places at once. The men at the front were getting bolder, the axe blows on the door more frequent and powerful. Suddenly, the world exploded in a shower of glass and frigid air. One of the henchmen had used the butt of his rifle to smash the small pantry window at the side of the cabin, a window they had overlooked in their haste. A blast of snow and wind ripped through the room, scattering embers from the hearth. A man, burly and bearded, began to climb through the shattered frame. He was focused on the back of the cabin, where Jedediah was still dealing with the threat of the fire. He didn't see Alara. He was lunging for Jedediah's exposed back. Tom seemed to slow down. Alara's fear, a cold, paralyzing weight just moments before, flash froze into something hard and sharp, protective fury. This man was not just attacking a stranger. He was trying to kill the man who had split her firewood, who had fortified her home, who had shown her how to be strong. He was trying to destroy her sanctuary. She did not think. She acted. She rose from behind the woodpile, the pistol coming up in a smooth, practiced motion, just as Jedediah had taught her. She saw not a man, but a threat to be eliminated. She pictured Clara's face, the warmth of her hearth, the feeling of Jedediah's hand guiding hers. She squeezed the trigger. The roar of the pistol was her own voice, a defiant scream against the violation. The man climbing through the window jerked as if hit by a bolt of lightning. A look of profound surprise crossed his face. He grunted a wet, final sound and then tumbled backward out of the window, disappearing into the white fury of the storm. She had done it. She had taken a life to save a life. There was no revulsion, no regret, only a cold, clear certainty. She had become a participant in her own salvation. Jedediah turned, his eyes wide, taking in the scene. The shattered window, the pistol smoking in her hand, the determined set of her jaw. A look of fierce pride, of profound respect, flashed across his face before he turned back to the fight. The tide had turned, but the battle was not over. The axe at the front door finally broke through. With a splintering crash, the top half of the door was smashed inward. Standing there, framed against the swirling snow, was not a henchman, but Silas Croft himself. He was a coward, but a possessive one. He had come to claim his prize. He saw Elara, saw the pistol in her hand, and his face twisted into a mask of rage and disbelief. He didn't charge. He was too smart, too craven for that. He grabbed the nearest of his own men and shoved him through the broken door. "Get them!" he shrieked. The henchman stumbled into the room, and Jedediah met him, not with a bullet, but with the full force of his body. The two men crashed to the floor in a brutal tangle of limbs. At that moment, Croft made his move. Seeing his chance, he scrambled through the doorway, but he didn't go for Jedediah. He lunged for Elara. He was faster than she would have guessed. He grabbed her wrist, twisting it brutally until she cried out in pain and the pistol clattered to the floor. He spun her around, pulling her tight against him, and pressed the cold, sharp steel of a Bowie knife to her throat. "It's over, Kane!" Croft screamed, his voice high and strained with a mixture of terror and triumph. He used Elara as a shield, his body shielded behind hers. "Drop the rifle, or the widow gets a new smile." Jedediah, having just dispatched the henchman with a series of savage blows, froze. He rose to his feet, his face a thunderous mask of pure, unadulterated fury. His rifle was in his hands, but it was useless. Croft had her. "You see," Croft panted, his foul breath hot on Elara's cheek. He was monologuing, drunk on his moment of perceived power. "I always win. This is my mountain. This is my land. You are nothing. An inconvenience." He pressed the knife harder, drawing a thin line of blood. "You should have just left when I told you to. You plain, stubborn old mule." The insult, so petty, so familiar, did not break Elara. It ignited her. Everything she had endured, the town's scorn, the loneliness, the fear, it all coalesced into a single point of white-hot rage. She was not plain. She was not old. She was not a mule. She was a survivor. She was a fighter. She looked past Croft's shoulder and saw the fireplace. Embers from a shattered window had ignited a small pile of kindling, and a few logs had rolled from the hearth. One was glowing a malevolent, cherry red. She remembered Jedediah's training. She remembered the weight of the pistol. She remembered the feeling of the can leaping from the stump. She was not a victim. With a guttural cry, she slammed her head backward, connecting solidly with Croft's nose. There was a satisfying crunch. He howled in pain, his grip momentarily loosening. It was all the opening she needed. She stomped down, hard, with the heel of her boot on his expensive leather shoe. As he gasped and stumbled, she twisted out of his grasp. She didn't run. She lunged for the fireplace. Her hand, wrapped in the thick wool of her sleeve, grabbed the end of the glowing log. The heat was immense, searing through the fabric, but she ignored the pain. She turned, a Valkyrie wreathed in smoke and fury, and shoved the burning end of the log directly into Silas Croft's smug, civilized face. The scream he let out was not human. It was the sound of a damned soul, a shriek of agony and terror that silenced the storm. He dropped the knife, clawing at his face, stumbling backward, his carefully constructed world of power and influence incinerated in an instant. Jedediah moved then, a blur of motion, kicking the knife away and bringing the butt of his rifle down on the back of Croft's head. The civilized tyrant crumpled to the floor, a whimpering, scorched ruin. The cabin fell silent. The battle was over. The remaining henchmen, seeing their leader fall, had vanished back into the storm. It was just the two of them, standing amidst the wreckage of their sanctuary, breathing heavily in the sudden, profound quiet. Elara dropped the log, her hand screaming with pain, and stared at the man twitching on her floor. She had done that. She had faced her demon and burned him down. She looked up at Jedediah, her eyes wild, her face smudged with soot. He looked back at her, his gaze filled with a raw, fierce admiration that was more intimate than any kiss. The resurrected phoenix and the gentle giant had one, together. The aftermath of the battle was a surreal tableau of destruction and quiet. The wind still howled outside, a mournful dirge for the violence that had transpired, but inside the cabin, a strange peace had settled. The immediate, life-or-death struggle was over, leaving behind a mess of splintered wood, shattered glass, and the acrid smells of gunpowder, burned flesh, and blood. Silas Croft lay unconscious on the floor, his face a mess of burns and bruises, his expensive suit ruined. A few feet away, the henchman Jedediah had fought lay still and silent. The bodies of the others were outside, already being claimed by the snow and the storm. Ilara stood trembling, the adrenaline that had fueled her now draining away, leaving her weak-kneed and shaking. She stared down at her right hand. The pain, which she had ignored in the heat of the moment, now made itself known, a throbbing, searing agony. The wool of her sleeve was scorched, and the skin of her palm was an angry red, already beginning to blister. Jedediah was by her side in an instant. He took her injured hand in his own massive, gentle ones, his touch surprisingly delicate as he examined the burn. His face, which had been a mask of warrior fury, softened with a profound concern that made her heart ache. "Here," he said, his voice a low rumble. He led her to the water basin and gently submerged her hand in the icy water. The relief was immediate and exquisite. He held her hand there, his thumb stroking the back of her wrist, a simple, comforting gesture that spoke volumes. They stood like that for a long moment, the chaos of the room fading away, their world shrinking to this single point of contact. It was a post-conflict comfort, a silent acknowledgement that they had passed through the fire together and emerged on the other side. I killed a man," Ilara whispered, the reality of her actions finally sinking in. The face of the man at the window, his expression of shock, was burned into her memory. "You saved my life," Jedediah corrected her, his voice firm, his pale gray eyes locking with hers. "You defended your home. There is no shame in that. You were magnificent." The word hung in the air between them. Magnificent. No one had ever called Ilara anything remotely like magnificent. Plain, quiet, stubborn. Those were the words her world had used. But in the eyes of this wild mountain man, she had been magnificent. A tear she hadn't realized she was holding back traced a clean path through the soot on her cheek. Their quiet moment was interrupted by the groan from the floor. Silas Croft was stirring. Jedediah's posture immediately hardened. He took a length of rope from his pack and, with grim efficiency, bound Croft's hands and feet, then gagged him with a strip of torn cloth to silence his whimpering. As the blizzard finally began to break the next morning, the sky lightening to a pearly gray, another figure appeared out of the swirling mist. It was Abe Hemlock, the old trapper, and with him was a stoic man wearing a tin star, the county marshal, a man named Elias Vance, known to be one of the few lawmen not in Croft's pocket. Abe, ever watchful, had seen the posse head up the mountain and had ridden through the night to the next county to fetch the one man he trusted to see justice done. The scene that greeted them was damning. The bodies in the snow, the bullet-riddled cabin, the burned and bound Silas Croft. It told a clear story. Jedediah, in his terse, functional way, explained the events, his account backed by Ilara's quiet, firm testimony. He also produced a leather-bound ledger he had taken from one of Croft's dead men, a detailed record of illegal land claims, bribes, and hired muscle, the final nail in Croft's coffin. The marshal listened patiently, his gaze missing nothing. He looked at Ilara's bandaged hand, at the determined set of her jaw, and at the way Jedediah stood slightly in front of her, a silent protector. He looked at the cowering, defeated Silas Croft. "Silas Croft," Marshal Vance said, his voice devoid of emotion, "I'm placing you under arrest for attempted murder, assault, arson, and a list of other charges I'm sure will come to light." He and Abe hauled the disgraced land baron to his feet. The surviving henchmen were rounded up, their fight gone, their loyalty as flimsy as the money they'd been paid. The legal claims against Ilara were exposed as fraudulent, her debt erased, and her deed to the land secured beyond any doubt. The reign of the civilized tyrant was over. As the marshal led his prisoners away down the mountain, a profound quiet descended once more. The sun, for the first time in days, broke through the clouds, bathing the snow-covered landscape in a brilliant, cleansing light. The world felt new, scrubbed clean. The immediate threat was gone. The battle was won. Justice of a sort had been served. A new, more subtle tension began to fill the silence. The purpose that had bound Elara and Jedediah together, their mutual defense against Croft, was now gone. He was a man of the mountains, a solitary wanderer by nature and by choice. She was a woman with a home, a place she had fought for and won. Their paths, which had converged so violently, now seemed destined to diverge once more. The crossroads had arrived. Elara watched as Jedediah began to gather his few belongings. He moved with the same quiet purpose he did everything else. He cleaned his rifle, repacked his bedroll, and refilled a small pouch with dried meat. Each action was a small, sharp pain in her chest. He was preparing to leave. He was a man who belonged to the wild, to the vast, lonely expanses of the high peaks. His duty here, as he saw it, was done. He had helped the woman who saved him, had seen his own enemy brought to justice. Now, the call of his solitary life was pulling at him. He believed he was doing the right thing, removing the dangerous, untamed element from her now peaceful life. He was preparing to fade back into the wilderness from which he had come, leaving her to the safety and security she had earned. Elara's heart, which had soared with triumph, now plummeted into a cold, empty space. The thought of this cabin, her hard-won sanctuary, without his presence, suddenly seemed unbearable. The silence she had once craved would now be a deafening, lonely void. The idea of facing the future, even a safe and secure one, without him by her side, was a prospect more daunting than facing Croft's guns. She had not just survived a battle for her land. She had been fundamentally changed, reborn in the crucible of conflict. And the man who had been both her catalyst and her anchor was about to walk away forever. He shouldered his pack and his rifle, turning to face her. The rugged, scarred face was impossible to read, but in his pale gray eyes, she saw a flicker of regret, a deep, sorrowful turmoil. He looked around the small cabin, at the repaired shutter, the neat stack of firewood, the memory of their shared fight hanging in the air. "You'll be safe now," he said, his voice a low gravel. It was meant to be a comfort, but it sounded like a farewell. "No one will trouble you here again." He took a step toward the door he had barred against the storm, the door he had defended with his life. Every instinct in Elara screamed. The timid widow who had dragged him from the snow was gone forever, replaced by the woman who had held a pistol and a burning log and had not backed down. That woman would not let the most important thing in her life walk out the door without a fight. "Jedediah," she said, her voice clear and strong, stopping him in his tracks. He turned slowly, his expression wary, expectant. She did not plead. She did not weep. She stood her ground, her chin held high, her gaze unflinching. She met his eyes, and for the first time, she did not feel intimidated by his size or his wildness. She felt his equal. "You are wrong," she stated simply. "I won't be safe. Not without you." The words hung in the sunlit air of the ravaged cabin. It was a plea, but it was not a plea of weakness. It was a declaration, a statement of a new and essential truth she had only just discovered about herself. "This place," she continued, her voice gaining strength, gesturing to the small room, to the mountains visible through the broken door, "it is more than just wood and stone to me now. You helped me fight for it. You helped me bleed for it. You helped me make it a home." She took a step toward him, closing the space between them. "And a home is not a place you can defend by yourself. It's a place you share." He stood as still as a great stone, his face a mask, but his eyes, those expressive winter sky eyes, were a storm of conflicting emotions. He was a man who had built his entire existence around the concept of solitude, of self-reliance. He had come to the mountains to escape connection, to escape the pain that came with loss. And now, This woman was offering him the one thing he feared and craved in equal measure, a place to belong. "Alara," he began, his voice rough, "I am not a man for homes and hearths. I am what I am, a wanderer, a dangerous man. Trouble follows me. Trouble found me long before you did," she countered, her voice softening but losing none of its intensity. "You're not trouble, Jedediah. You're the reason I am still standing here. You taught me how to be strong. Don't you see? My life before you was a slow death. I was fading, letting the world tell me I was too old, too plain, too weak." She reached out, her bandaged hand coming to rest on his chest, right over his heart. "You saw me. Not the widow, not the burden. You saw me, and I see you. I see the good, gentle man who pets a lamb and the fierce warrior who defends the innocent. I see the man I—" She stopped, her breath catching. The word was too new, too powerful, too terrifying to say aloud. But it was there, in her eyes, shining with a fierce, undeniable light. "I'm not asking you to give up the mountains," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "They are in your blood. I'm asking you to share them with me. Don't go back to being alone. Stay. Stay here. With me." It was the bravest thing she had ever done, more terrifying than facing Croft's knife. She was laying her heart, newly resurrected and still so fragile, at his feet. She had offered him a promise, a shared future, a partnership, a home. Jedediah looked down at her small, bandaged hand on his chest. He looked at her face, illuminated by the morning sun, her expression a mixture of hope and fear. He saw the woman who had pulled him from the snow, who had stitched his flesh, who had stood beside him in battle, who had faced down her own demon and burned him with righteous fire. He saw her strength, her resilience, her fire. He saw a future he had never dared to imagine for himself. The solitude he had sought for so long suddenly felt like what it truly was, a cold, empty exile. She was not a chain, not an anchor holding him down. She was an anchor holding him steady. She was his harbor. Slowly, deliberately, he reached up and unshouldered his pack, letting it slide to the floor with a soft thud. He leaned his rifle against the wall. Then his large, calloused hands came up to frame her face, his touch as reverent as a prayer. He looked deep into her eyes, and the last of the walls around his lonely heart crumbled into dust. "This is home," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before. And it was not a resignation. It was a revelation. It was a commitment. The following spring arrived as a revelation, painting the mountains in vibrant strokes of green and gold. The harsh, unforgiving white of winter melted away, feeding the roaring creeks and nurturing the fields of wildflowers that burst forth on the slopes. The air was sweet with the scent of pine and damp earth, a promise of renewal and life. The cabin on Widow's Peak, a name no one used anymore, was transformed. The splintered door had been replaced with a new, stronger one crafted by Jedediah's hands. The shattered window was now a larger pane of glass that let the morning sun stream in. A new porch rail, carved from sturdy pine, ran the length of the front, and on it sat 2 chairs instead of one. Alara's sister, Clara, a bright-eyed girl of 16 with a spirit as resilient as her sister's, had come to live with them. Freed from the oppressive atmosphere of the town and the shadow of Silas Croft, she blossomed in the clean mountain air, her laughter a frequent, joyful sound that echoed in the clearing. She adored Jedediah, trailing after him like a puppy as he went about his chores, listening with rapt attention to his quiet lessons about the woods. The 3 of them had become a family, forged not by blood, but by choice, by shared trial, and by a deep, abiding love. The rhythm of their life was one of quiet, contented work. They planted a large garden. Its neat rose a testament to their shared effort. Jedediah taught Alara and Clara to track, to read the weather in the clouds, to understand the language of the forest. Alara, in turn, filled the cabin with a warmth and comfort he had never known, her cooking and steady presence turning the rough outpost into a true home. One evening, as the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in fiery shades of orange and pink, Ilara and Jedediah stood on the porch, watching Clara chase butterflies in the meadow below. The scene was one of perfect, hard-won peace. Jedediah came to stand behind Ilara, wrapping his massive arms around her waist and pulling her back against his solid chest. She leaned into his embrace, her head resting on his shoulder, a perfect fit. The scars on his face and hands were no longer marks of a dangerous past, but simply part of the man she loved, the landscape of the one who had anchored her world. "Are you happy, Ilara?" he asked, his voice a low rumble beside her ear. She smiled, a slow, genuine smile that reached her eyes, making them sparkle. "I have never understood the meaning of the word until now," she confessed. She turned in his arms to face him, her hand, now fully healed, coming up to trace the line of the old scar on his cheek. "They used to call me too old and too plain. They saw a woman who was finished." "They were fools," Jedediah said, his gaze intense, filled with the fierce, protective love that she had come to know so well. "They saw a field in winter and thought it was barren. They didn't have the eyes to see the strength waiting beneath the snow." He lowered his head, and his lips met hers. It was not a kiss of frantic passion, but one of deep, soulful connection, a kiss that spoke of shared history and a promised future. It was a kiss of gratitude, of partnership, of a love that had been forged in the heart of a storm and had emerged as strong and enduring as the mountains themselves. They had faced the darkness together and had built a life in the light. The noble savage had found his purpose, the resurrected phoenix had found her strength, and in each other, they had finally, truly found home. And so, our story finds its end, but their journey, in many ways, has just begun. It's a tale that reminds us that strength is often found not in the absence of fear, but in facing it down. It shows us that true beauty isn't about the smoothness of one's skin, but the resilience of one's spirit. And it proves that sometimes the most desolate landscapes and the most broken hearts can give rise to the most profound and enduring love. They were two outcasts, a man the world saw as a beast and a woman the world saw as a burden. But together they found a kingdom.